So we're now in our 5th year of farming, and one of the questions I find that I get the most is, where did I get the money to start my farm? You know, for many folks who have the dream of starting a farm of their own, the need for capital to get your farm started often seems like this massive obstacle, which is just absolutely impossible to overcome. And so I wanted to put this video together as just a down and dirty guide to show folks the 6 ways that I feel like you can actually get money to start your farm. Some of these methods I've used myself personally. Other methods are things that other folks have used. Some methods I would recommend. Other methods I would strongly advise against. But I did want to make this video as a guide for all of you because I get so many comments and messages and emails from folks asking this very specific question, and so I wanted to kind of pull together my best information. Also, at the end of this video, I'll leave a playlist of other videos that I've made about how much money we've made on our farm, how much money it costs to start our farm, like all of those details. I'm not gonna get into that today, but I did wanna give you the basics on how to pay for your farm. So like I said, I think there's actually 6 ways to get money to start a farm. And method number 1 is the one that I've most heavily personally relied on. And quite simply, that's dipping into your own personal savings and paying for your farm stuff. Whether it's buying land or equipment or resources or building materials or animals. I would say that the majority of the money that we used to start Goldshaw Farm came from my personal savings. You know, I worked a number of jobs over the years in the city, and I was very lucky to make a good income from those jobs. At the same time, my wife and I live pretty frugally, and we don't have children, and so our expenses are relatively low. The combination of those things let us have a really aggressive savings rate. And so when we bought our property that actually is our farm, you know, 100% of that money was paid for by savings. Eventually we sold our house in Washington, DC. That also contributed to the nest egg that we had. So to be wicked transparent for many folks who are watching these videos out there and wondering how are we able to afford to do what we do, a big part of it is rooted in that. You know, furthermore, not having debt and having those low expenses meant that the ongoing run rate and burn rate of the farm and our lifestyle associated with living on the farm was also wicked low. Now, that's not to say that that's something that everybody can do, but it's something that we very specifically did. But all of that said, I think relying on personal savings as one part of your farm funding puzzle is actually important. Number 1, it's gonna mean you have a greater personal equity stake in your farm. Number 2, it's gonna mean that you just actually have like skin in the game and you're invested in it. Now, my own personal bias would say that if you're starting a farm with somebody else's money, I don't think you're gonna treat how you spend some of that money with as much care. It's just simply human nature. You spend your money way more carefully than you spend other people's money. Now, that's not to say that I think that you can't start a farm with somebody else's money. We'll get more into that later in this video. It's just that I personally think it's important to have a portion of your startup funds come from your own pocket. I think the other thing to note, and I mentioned this in the video about how much it costs to start our farm, your farm startup costs don't necessarily need to be as high as you think they need to be. So for example, you don't actually have to buy a farm to have a farm. I know many a successful farmer who has rented land, and that's how they pay for what they do. And by renting that land, they're able to get their farm business going without the massive and sometimes stifling cost of owning the land. You know, if you look at what's happened in the real estate market over the last few years, you know, that's something that could easily price out most farmers and keep them from getting started, when I actually think that the most important element for starting a farm is starting your farm. I've found that you learn so much by doing and being on the land and working with the animals or working with the plants that you're working with. And so to get started in doing something, I think is more important than doing nothing, working constantly, and just dreaming of one day hoping to start a farm. The sooner you can dip your itty bitty toe in, even if it's just growing stuff on your back porch, the faster you're gonna be able to get up to speed and have the ability to scale up. And one of the things I'm personally finding is that scaling up is one of the long-term important elements for being able to have a successful farm business. So the second way that you can get the money you need to start your farm is to use loans. You know, loans can come to you in a variety of forms. They can come from a bank, they can come from the government, they can come from friends and family. But regardless of their source, the premise of a loan is obvious, right? Somebody gives you money, you gotta pay them back that money, and usually you gotta pay them back that money with interest. When it comes to starting a farm, I personally am not a big fan of loans. And let me explain to you why. So when you're starting a farm, you're starting a small business. And in starting that small business, you're essentially operating on a very narrow tightrope. You are gonna be fighting to survive. You're gonna be fighting to keep your head above water. You're gonna make mistakes that are gonna cost you money. You're gonna make mistakes that are gonna blow up your business plans. For folks who might be trying to start a farm without a significant agricultural background, you're gonna have this steep learning curve. You're gonna be fighting things like nature and animal sickness and pests that could affect your crops. Like, there is so much that can go wrong with a farming business plan. I feel like the last thing that you need when you're starting a farm is the additional pressure of having to make loan payments and having to deal with interest. I mean, look, if you're an experienced farmer and you're starting a new business and you want to take some loans, I get that. Also, if you buy a property as your home and you're going to use that property as part of your farm business and you need to take out a mortgage to buy that, I understand that as well. But I also see a lot of folks who will try to start a farm by taking out a bunch of loans or maxing out their credit cards. If debt is your primary source for starting your business, I think you are precariously walking on that small business tightrope, and I just don't feel like it's gonna go good for you. And again, I don't want this to be misconstrued to say that there aren't people who might have been successful by floating things for a month or two with credit cards or doing things like that. My point is just simply, yes, it is a mechanism you can use to fund your business. Yes, for more mature businesses, taking out debt and using debt as a way to structure your business operations and manage things like depreciation, they can totally make sense. But if you're a newbie farmer and you're just starting out and you have dreams of one day having a farm and you decide to use a loan as a way to get that farm going, I think you're just stacking the deck against yourself. And that goes too for like borrowing money from friends and family, because your chances of being successful are relatively low. If you're not successful, you could damage those relationships. And I'd argue that sometimes the damage to those relationships is actually more of a drawback than just having your farm business itself fail. So yes, number 2 is you can use loans, but I also strongly caution you against it. Now, the third way that you can get money for your farm, and it's the one that most people have the most questions about, is by using grants. You know, many government agencies, as well as nonprofits out there, as well as even some for-profit organizations, all have grants that they're willing to offer to new farmers. Like, this money can be in the form of grants for specific equipment, grants for specific farming practices, grants for new farmers, grants for farmers from a variety of backgrounds and cultural heritages. You know, there is a fair amount of money out there and available for folks if they're interested in it. But I will admit that personally, I'm not a massive fan of grants, because I find that grants often come with a lot of strings attached. Now, I know I'm coming from a place of some extreme privilege in being able to say that, right? Oh, would you look at that? This plastic feed bin just broke. Bring that back down. Because a lot of grants might require you to check in and give updates on progress, which is perfectly reasonable. They also might require you to build certain projects and do them in certain ways. Oftentimes the grants will also have requirements like it's matching funding, so you have to have at least half the money to do a project. For example, like, you know, doing some repairs around the farm or fencing projects. Or the grant provider will require you to put up all the initial funding and then they will pay you back at the end. All of those things can be barriers for folks who might want to use grants. And then I will also say, for me personally, navigating the complexities of the application process and the selection process and doing that stuff right is an absolute art form. And the people who can do it well are amazing, and they really have my awe. But for me, it's something I painfully struggle at. And so I've never actually used a grant here on our farm. You know, a couple years back, we actually applied for a grant to fix up our barn. You know, the barn is like 130 plus years old and it has needed some repairs, and it's not necessarily something that fits into my business plan for the farm. But the state of Vermont actually has a fund for helping fix up old barns. And even though we were awarded the grant, we ended up not taking the opportunity to use the funds for the grant. First off, when we actually tried to do the repairs, it was like right in the middle of COVID and like the initial lockdowns, and so we couldn't find anybody to do the work for us. And then second, the next year when I tried to go do the work, I actually felt really guilty about using state funds to pay for my private property here. I will admit, I personally have a moral objection to, you know, taking tax dollars and using them to enhance somebody's private business enterprise. Yeah, I guess you could make some sort of sketchy argument that it helps the greater good, but I will profess to be the type that will say that I don't think it's necessarily government's place to be making those decisions and redirecting my dollars or your dollars or whoever else is paying those tax dollars to do something that could be considered a vanity project by some. And so I've actually done all of our barn repairs so far by using our farm money to do that. Again, I know I come from a place of some extreme privilege to be able to do that, whether it's thinking about my financial wherewithal that I accumulated prior to starting the farm, or the success we've had on our farm with things like social media, which has also helped fund a lot of our enterprises, and I'll talk more about later in this video. So I guess here on Goldshaw Farm, we can either say that we proudly, or stupidly, depending on your perspective, have never ever taken grant money to get the farm going. But that's not to say I think it's necessarily a bad thing for others to think about. I think there is a lot of opportunity out there. There's a lot of ways to pay for key infrastructure, like for example, fencing. You know, so for somebody thinking about starting a farm, I would not discourage them from thinking about potentially using grants to get the money to start that farm. The only other caution I would offer up is recognize that it's not as easy as you think. I remember when I was a city dweller and still dreaming about starting this farm, I was like thinking, oh, I could just, you know, get grants to start my farm. It's like this magical pool of money that's out there. And I would caution people against making those assumptions in their business plans. If you can leverage a grant to help further your operation, awesome, mazel tov, good for you. But I think it's very unwise to think of it as a guaranteed pool of money that's gonna be there for you. And then number two, I think it's unwise to make any assumptions without doing significant research and work and understanding what the actual specific grants are. Do not think about this amorphous pool of grant money.
Goes through and inspects all the cattle.
Toby, what are you doing? You know, another method that's out there that you could use to start your farm is something known as crowdfunding. You know, that's where you use a platform like Kickstarter to get a bunch of people interested in your operation, and you offer them some sort of value. And in return for that value you offer them, they give you money. You can use that money to help support your farming operations. And in a lot of ways, I'm actually very negative on using something like crowdfunding to start your farming operation. When it comes to farms, I feel like it's a great deal for the farmer, but it's not a good deal for the funder. Like, I personally only feel it works if you as the farmer offer a tremendous amount of value to the people out there funding your project. If you do not do that, you are just simply asking for a handout. And look, I get that everybody needs a little bit of help every once in a while, but I think you need to be careful about basing your entire business model on handouts. Now, with that disclaimer said, I will say that a certain part of our farm's business model actually takes from crowdfunding. You see, I've been pretty upfront about how we use the revenue that we generate with social media to fund our farming operations. So for example, this video of mine that you are watching right now is running online, and the online video platform that's running the video is putting advertising up against it. And so you as the viewer of this video are also viewing some of that advertising. Those advertisers pay both the platform and me money, and then I take that money and I use that for our farm. That is a very non-traditional way to fund a farm, but I do see it almost as a form of crowdsourcing, because just by simply watching, I'm giving you, the viewer, something, and then by taking your time to watch, you're giving me, the farmer, something that comes in the form of money. When it comes to an exchange like that, I feel good about it, because you could just simply choose not to watch my videos, and then you're choosing not to give us money. And so to me, that feels very fair. And so I have no moral qualms or ethical hangups when it comes to a form of crowdsourcing that looks like that. What I would struggle more with is like saying, hey, I want folks to crowdfund me, and give me money to plant a whole bunch more trees and put in a whole bunch more infrastructure. Unless I was giving you like a share of the nuts that my trees produce as a part of the exchange, I would feel like I'd be short shrifting you in that exchange. I think the only other way that I could reasonably foresee me doing crowdfunding is like in two specific instances. One, which is pretty much imminent right now, I'm getting ready to publish a book, and if I end up going the self-publishing route, I will probably set up a Kickstarter to fund the actual printing and publication of that book. Again, I feel absolutely a-okay about an exchange like that. You're giving me money, I'm giving you a book or special things associated with the book, and it's a good deal. There could be other examples where I was starting a new business here on the farm and I would crowdfund certain elements of it, but I would want to make sure that I was giving value to the investor and that everybody felt like they were getting a good deal here. You know, the only other thing I would say on crowdfunding is there's a very common farming business model known as a CSA or community supported agriculture, which is effectively crowdfunding. That's where somebody is paying a farmer up front, say a couple $100s, and then they have a commitment from the farmer to give them whatever their farm's producing over a period of time. It's a very popular model when it comes to farming because the farmer gets the upfront capital that they need to get their farming operation going, and then the consumer gets to benefit from success that the farmer has by getting that produce or eggs or meat or whatever it is in return later in the season as it becomes available. Sometimes people don't think about that as crowdfunding, but I personally see it as crowdfunding. And again, that's a situation where I see crowdfunding as a good deal for both the farmer and the consumer. And so I do think it's a very reasonable way to approach funding your farm. Now, the fifth way that you could fund your farm is by taking on investors. And when I say taking on investors, I mean very specifically, you are essentially giving an equity portion of your farm business to somebody who's essentially buying in to your farm. While structurally investors can look more like a crowdfunding type of situation, when it comes to the risks and challenges of investors, I think it's actually a lot more like taking a loan. You have more people you have to answer to, you have a lot more pressure that you have to perform. If it's coming from friends and family, you could be risking those relationships. And so particularly for a beginning farmer just looking to start out, I think investors could work, but it would not be the way I would personally want to go. Again, as a beginning farmer, you're going to have so much you need to focus on. Having to appease investors and make money for them, I don't know if that's something you'd want to take on as well. That said, for some people in certain contexts, it could be the perfect situation. So please don't let any of the advice in this video serve as the be-all end-all. This is just simply my perspective on what could work or what couldn't work, as well as the strengths and weaknesses each method could have for you. Now, the final method I want to talk about is called cash flowing. And this is one of my favorite methods for starting a farm. So cash flow is essentially taking the money you have from your farm business and using it to pay for additional parts of your farm business. You know, when Goldshaw Farm first started, you know, one of the first businesses that we got into was raising ducks. We ended up getting 40 ducklings from a hatchery, and the plan was that by the end of that first season, we would take most of the drakes or male ducks and cull them and sell them for meat. That way we would be paying for all of the upfront feed costs that we'd outlay to raise the ducks from being ducklings to adult ducks that were laying eggs. And so the startup costs for the duck operation were actually funded by the duck operation by just being smart with my cash flows. I knew that I was gonna have this initial cash outlay when I first bought the ducks all the way to when I slaughtered the male ducks. But doing that smart planning helped me stay pretty much break even when it came to the duck operation and as I was getting it started. And remember, I was doing all of that long before we had a large social media following. I just simply put out an ad on Facebook and Craigslist and asked people in my local area if they wanted to buy duck meat, and that's how I found my customers. So remember, it doesn't have to be hard to get your farm business going. You know, another example of cash flowing is pretty much how I raise my goslings. You know, I sell my goose eggs as some initial things that happen early on in the season to help pay for my geese. Then I'll sell live birds as they're this age. And then once I go to harvest them in the fall, I'll sell those as well. Each one of those moments creates an opportunity to drive revenue for my farm business. And they all stack on top of each other. So if you're looking to start a farm, I think it's a very reasonable way to think about stages of growth for your farm. You know, I pretty much always dreamed of having cattle on our farm, but I knew I needed to build up skills and I knew I needed to build up the farm business before I'd be ready for it. You know, in 2018, when we started our farming operations, we weren't in a position to pay all the money required for the cattle. By waiting and maturing, we were actually able to be in a better financial position to pay for the cattle, not from our own pockets, but from the pocketbook of our farm business. So in some ways, that might be my long-winded way of saying that you should really think about starting small and growing your business. Don't cannonball into the deep end of the pool. Give yourself the opportunity to build up and let your business pay for your business. And you know, even if that means having to have a day job to support your farming operations, there is no shame in that. You know, I've seen this statistic out there from the USDA that like 90% of family farms have to operate with off-farm income. You know, for the first 4 years of our farm, I actually had to have a day job. And it really wasn't until January when I finally quit and started working from the farm full time. So please, as you're thinking about your future business plans and your farm startup plans, don't feel like you have to go whole hog. Now, as you've gathered as I've gone through all 6 of these items here, and feel free to go back if you want to screenshot it. And I know I've hinted at this throughout the video, but for us, we've really relied on 3 things to help fund our farm business. We relied on personal savings, we relied on crowdfunding by way of creating social media content, and then number 3, we have used cash flowing to help drive the growth of the business. I'm not saying that those are the right ways to do it, I'm just saying that's how we've done it. I think there are a ton of different options you can go for how you start to farm your farm. So much of it depends on your personal business situation and financial context. You shouldn't be basing it off of just some dude you see on YouTube. But if you want to learn more about how we started our farm, check out this video playlist right here. It'll give you lots of thoughts and ideas and see where we've succeeded and where we failed. Thanks for watching, everybody.